Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video we're going to talk about skill isolation and drill development. You may have heard me say somewhere in the past, be it on the internet in a comment or in a video or in a class, that there's a significant difference between a drill and a scenario. They both serve their purpose. Generally understood, a drill gives you the metrics. You get your time, your distance, and your accuracy. You know it ahead of time. You understand the conditions that you have to shoot under, and you're aware of the environment and when it's going to happen. And there's the artificiality of knowing all of those facts prior to having to shoot. Whereas a scenario, most of those facts are unknown to you prior to the scenario beginning. But drills are very important because they allow us to isolate skills to develop proficiency with the skills that we're trying to develop, from the smallest to the largest to the most, to the simple to the complex. They give us the ability to take apart a process and focus on very specific things, one step or maybe 2 or 3 steps at a time. And that's where they're very, very beneficial. You won't find any professional training, even outside of firearms, it doesn't have some type of drill-based training worked into it if it's a physical skill. I'm a big fan of deliberate practice. You probably heard me talk about that as well. I think I did a video specifically on it, and I always recommend people read one very specific book as a primer to start them down the road of learning about it, about deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is the conscious focusing on certain aspects of a skill while you perform it. So kind of an easy example would be if I'm working on, let's say, from a high ready on a rifle, bringing up, establishing my dot holdover at say 3 yards and firing 1 round in, I don't know, let's put a time limit on it, 1.5 seconds. If I'm deliberately practicing that technique, let's say I perform it 10 times and I only meet the standard once. What did I do wrong 9 times? I have to understand what that is. So what I'm going to do for the next 10 iterations is I'm going to focus on one very specific aspect of what I'm doing. It may be the safety sweep, it may be the actual trigger press, it may be the dot settling, it may be the sight picture. Any number of these things are what I'm going to focus on. And of course, the more complex the task you're trying to perform or trying to accomplish, the more steps you're going to be able to focus on along the way. So what I'm trying to do is understand why I'm failing if I'm failing. It's often not something so simple as I just wasn't fast enough. There was some kind of inefficiency in the process that caused you to not be fast enough if speed is your metric. And of course, speed ultimately determines, if we're looking at distance and accuracy, speed is that third metric that most people look at if you meet the first 2 standards. How fast can you do things accurately at what distance? Generally how we're looking at things. But when I'm thinking about isolating a skill, that's all I'm going to be doing. So if I'm working on drawing from concealment and shooting a target at 5 yards, I'm not going to incorporate other possibly realistic things into that because I'm isolating a skill for a drill purpose to develop a technique to develop proficiency. I understand if I'm shooting at a real threat and cover is available, then I should probably get to that cover if it makes sense. However, I'm not going to work that necessarily into my drill because I'm isolating the skill of draw, engage at the metrics that I'm trying to establish, the distance, the accuracy, and the time. That's a drill. If I wanted somebody to use cover, I would introduce them to a scenario to where cover was available and see if they actually chose to use it. If I'm teaching a block on cover, I'm going to use cover. I'm going to talk about cover and how to use a handgun or a rifle or whatever the weapon is around cover. I'm not going to introduce cover and reloads and tack reloads and malfunctions and all these other skills into every single drill that I do, because then I'm task loading to such a degree that I'm losing focus on what I'm actually trying to accomplish. So every now and then I'll see a video on the internet and there's always at least one guy in the comment, oh, you didn't move on your draw. Well, okay. Not everybody subscribes to that technique of move on the draw, and sometimes it makes perfectly good sense to not move when you draw. But also, if they're isolating a skill, why would they be moving? Moving is for later. Maybe moving isn't something they're working on at that time. Of course, the argument is, well, you should always do these things. And I'm like, oh, really? You predict the future. And if you can predict the future to that degree, well, then you don't really need a gun at all, because you're never going to find yourself in a situation where you need a gun, because you can see that coming and just not go. Kind of see where I'm going with this? It's an isolation. So anytime I see comments like that, and there's no reason in the video for me to think that that should be part of the drill, I kind of got to think, is that person actually utilizing the ability of critically thinking through what they're watching? Are they seeing what they're seeing? I see it on my videos sometimes too, where it'll be a video of a force-on-force scenario, and somebody will be like, well, you know it's coming because everybody's wearing masks. I challenge you to safely perform force-on-force without them. Safety is always going to be the artificiality in training. That's something that we're going to have to deal with. As an instructor, and you may get this as well as a shooter, sometimes we get tired of answering the same questions over and over and over and over again. For you, you can kind of just get frustrated and be like, look, dude, I've explained this enough, I've talked about this enough, I'm just tired of talking about it. Me as an instructor, I don't really have that luxury. And it's not something I mind, it's not something I get angry about, but it's definitely something that can be frustrating sometimes when, for the wealth of information that's out there, all the videos and all the instructors putting out great information and all the classes that are easily accessible, people still fixate on trying to make everything super realistic to the point of it being unrealistic, if that makes any sense. Drills are literally for skill isolation. So if I want to isolate a skill, what's the best way to build a drill? First thing I want to do is have a clear understanding of what I'm actually trying to accomplish. What am I working on, and just focus on that. If I'm working on handgun skills, okay, that's too broad of a topic. I need to be more specific. Am I working on accuracy? Am I working on proficiency? Am I working on movement? Am I working on mechanics? What am I actually trying to isolate? So let's say, for sake of example, I want to work on accuracy. There's already a great number of drills out there. You don't necessarily have to create your own. You can borrow from other people. I don't think there's such a thing as an original drill these days. Everybody's kind of taken from other pieces, whether they realize it or not. Dot torture is an excellent example of working on accuracy. Because remember, we're just focusing on accuracy. If that's our standard, we're not trying to introduce speed yet. But you can also take dot torture and do it for speed and accuracy. It's going to lead to some frustration, but it's an excellent opportunity to explore deliberate practice. If you're not meeting the accuracy standard, what are you actually doing? What are you seeing? What's going on? How are you feeling? Are you consciously paying attention to things? If I'm shooting, again, dot torture, we'll use that as an example. I'm going to shoot it from 3. If I throw a round, do I recognize why I threw the round? Did I feel a pressure difference in my grip? Did I feel like I had a little bit of pre-ignition push as the trigger broke? Was my sight alignment not as good as it could have been? Was my dot placement on a RDS not as good as it could have been? I've got all these things that I'm observing, but once we even get somewhat proficient with them, we tend to let them go on cruise control and we stop paying attention to them. And while I don't believe that you can't teach yourself things, sometimes you need a third party to observe you, or you can set up your cell phone, because you're probably going to have it with you. Set up your cell phone camera to film you while you're performing. And this is something I do myself. I usually use like a GoPro with my phone remote, because they're Bluetooth and whatnot. And I'll set it up on a stand, and I'll go ahead and shoot. And when I make a mistake, and I know I make a mistake, I'll actually look at the camera and be like, review that. That way I know I don't have to guess as I'm watching through the video what I'm looking at. Or, I mean, because it is a GoPro, I'll make the mistake, I'll grab the camera, film the target, put the camera back down and be like, review that. So that way I know to look at what my technique was, or with, because technology is so awesome, I can look at the video right then and be like, okay, this is what I was doing wrong. This is an option that you have. Technology can definitely help you if you don't have someone to come to the range and practice with you. Your drills don't have to have a super high round count unless the focus of the drill is developing a skill that requires a round count. So if I want to work on recoil control, I'm going to have to generate some recoil. And I'm going to have to generate some recoil quickly. If I'm firing 1 round every second, I'm not really doing anything with recoil management. I'm basically resetting the gun at that point. If you want recoil, you've got to get on the gun a little bit. Not necessarily trying to do a mag dump, but you've got to have a higher cadence of fire in order to start working on the skills of recoil mitigation. So yeah, you're going to have to invest 100, 200, 300 rounds in that range trip to just isolate and work on recoil management. For me, I found the best time to work on recoil management is during a class that I'm going to take, because I'm going to shoot probably 500 to 1,000 rounds anyway. So while I'm learning, I'm also focusing on my recoil management throughout the class, because I'm going to shoot the rounds anyway, and that's great. It gives me the opportunity to deliberately focus on that one thing. If I don't have that opportunity, if you don't have that opportunity, set aside some ammo every chance you get, so at least once every couple of months you have a considerable amount of ammunition to shoot for recoil management or whatever skill you're focusing on that has a higher round count. If I'm just focusing on distance shooting, again, doesn't take a whole lot of ammo. If I'm just focusing on trigger control, doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of ammo. But there are some skills such as cadence and getting used to red dots on handguns, where you're going to have to invest more ammunition than you would otherwise in some of the other techniques that are out there. Once you create a drill, write it down. record your metrics, record your performance, and see how well you're performing. And if you recognize inefficiencies that are causing you to not perform as well as you will, write that down too. Keep a very good, concise journal. It doesn't have to be much. I do it on my phone in my notes section, where I can be like, okay, this is the drill I'm working on. This is the best I've ever done it, and is it repeatable? And once a drill gets repeatable, it's time to make it harder. So if, again, as an example, if my goal is one round on steel, let's say an 8-inch plate at 100 yards with the rifle in 2 seconds. So I get my beep, I come up, 2 seconds later, I'm able to get my hit. Once I meet that standard and it's repeatable, I can do it 10 times in a row, beep, bang, beep, bang, so on and so forth. Now it's time to either reduce my par time or move the plate out, change some metric in some way to make myself a little bit less comfortable with the skill. Of course, I can still shoot that same drill, maybe to warm up, but I'm always going to be striving towards a higher degree of performance. In that particular example, I'd probably just take maybe 0.25 seconds off my par time. So I'd have to do it in 175, and then I'd go to 150. And I'd get to the point where I literally couldn't do it any faster, and then I would change some other metric or work on some other skill. Once I've established a proficiency, at that point it's not necessarily maintenance, I'm still striving to perform better, but I'd still shoot that drill at whatever my new par time was. So if I got down to a second's worth of performance and I just couldn't be repeatable under a second, then okay, that's probably as good as I'm gonna get at that, because everybody's gonna have a performance height on whatever the particular skill is. You just gotta find it. And finally, we tend to only work on things we're comfortable with because we're already proficient at them. And when we do branch out, we have a very small departure from whatever that proficiency is. So if we're already good at concealment shooting, we're probably not going to get too far away from that concealment shooting. If we're really good at 3 and 5 and 7, we're probably not going to move too much further back unless someone else makes us. So a good thing that you can do if you realize, like, hey, I'm only working on what I'm already comfortable with or proficient with, is have another person, even if they don't come to the range with you, have another buddy that you normally shoot with, say, hey, here's the drills you should work on. The one thing I'd hate to see people do is go to the range, unless it's strictly like, hey, we're just going to the range for fun. We're just going to go shoot whatever, you know? I hate when people go to deliberately practice their self-defense focused skills and they don't go with a plan. You got to have some kind of plan going in there and just focus on those things and work on those things. Having too many people in your little range trip party can actually complicate things, because you'll get at least 1 or 2 people who don't take things maybe as seriously as you do. So it kind of complicates what you're actually able to work on. So my advice to you is keep it small, keep your circle tight when it comes to shooters. Find guys that are very like-minded and help each other out by, like, hey, here's your drills, you give me your drills. You can even do it on note cards, or you guys can come up with some kind of, I don't know, drill roulette, if you will. Give you something to focus on to develop that proficiency with. And don't get your feelings hurt if they're identifying, hey, you're kind of not really doing this very well or that very well, and here's what I observed, or here's what you should work on. Because we're all supposed to be on the same team. So hopefully this advice is helpful to you in your own drill creation. And again, if you can't think of anything, there's plenty of stuff out there that'll probably be right up the alley of what you're trying to work on. But of course, the first step is identifying and being honest with where you're actually deficient, and finding drills that are going to help you build the skill set you need to be repeatable and correct that deficiency. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.